Good morning. It's 11 a.m. on a Sunday, and I'm going to do my best to make a tutorial to take you through a network I really like that basically is a really simple way of making particle trails in tops and also applying a sort of a plexus effect by combining different data types. Let's get started. I'm going to zoom out and mute that for the time being and start from scratch. To start off this network, I'm going to create a noise texture, and I'm going to draw that out to a null, which is going to be the end of our chain. Before I start making any changes to that noise, I'm also going to create a constant chop, and this chop is going to allow me to set some parameters that I want to kind of use throughout the patch. So I'm going to call this particles. This is going to be the number of particles that I'm generating per texture, and I'm going to say, let's say 20 to start off with. I'm going to make the viewer active. I'm going to hold my mouse over that piece of data and I'm going to drag onto noise. I'm going to go to the common page and I'm going to hover over resolution and drop and say chop reference. So now I'm going to scale my noise to 20 by 20 pixels. I'm going to right click to bring up that viewer. You can right click again to say view as points, or you can simply hit the V key, which is going to give you a visualization as an image or as a point cloud. So the first thing that we want to do is, let's just have that up in the background so we can see. And let's bring that back to being a point cloud. The first thing I want to do in my noise is I want to change it from monochrome, which just gives us this one line, to RGBA. So I'm getting a smattering of points, kind of hard to see in the wider viewer, but you can see here it's now spread out. Just for the purposes of this example, I'm going to massively ramp the points up. And so we can see that this noise is kind of across the spectrum in a sort of a square-like pattern. What we really want to do to make a nicer form of noise that's more evenly spread is in the pixel format, click that drop-down menu and select 32-bit float RGBA. So we can see now that's spread out much more nicely. We're not clipping it. We're able to go from negative to positive values much more easily. Going back to the noise tab, I'm going to move that offset down to 0. So now we can see that our noise is centered. Because I want to have each particle sort of being fairly unique in feel, I'm going to take down this period to something really low, so it just becomes very, very visually noisy. When we have less particles and we're animating them, it will feel that each particle has much more of its own agency, versus if we have something like this, where particles maybe move in chorus a little bit more. So I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to take down my constant particle number back down to 20, and I want to animate that noise. So I'm going to go into transform, and I'm going to go into the final parameter of translate, so the Z parameter, and I'm going to put in our favorite command, abs time dot seconds. You can see that's moving pretty fast, so I'm going to multiply it by 0.1 to slow it down. You can go ahead and multiply it by even smaller values, like 0.05, to have an even slower movement on that noise. Before I go further and start creating my trails, I want to instance this as a system in geometry. So I'm going to create a circle. We'll mix up the geometry later, but I'm going to start out real simple at the start. Plug it into a transform. I'm going to turn that scale down to something like 0.02. Drag that into a geo. And we're going to turn on our instancing flag in the instancing tab. I'm going to drag in my null. I'm actually just going to change this to pos. Yep, change that so we have that labeled so we know what it is. Change that to pos, and we'll do RGBA. B. So now we're referencing all those points in our instance network. If I move around, we can see that they're appearing. You know what? I'm going to use a sphere instead, so we don't have that sort of 2D look when we rotate. This should be much better. Let's try this. Oh yeah, much, much better. I'm going to press the H key to home that, turn off the viewer. And before we start adding in trails and things like that, let's just add in a simple render network. So I'll make my render. I'll bring in a camera. There we go, we can see that. And for the time being, I'm just going to use a constant to texture this. I'm going to drag this out into an RGB key so we have a black background, and then finally a null, which I'll call output. And I'm going to turn on that display tag so we can see what's going on. I don't particularly want to see this in the background while I'm working, so I'm going to right click, go to display, and turn off backdrop tops. If I do option key and left square bracket, which you can also find in this little menu here, and if I hit this menu or hit Alt 4, I can just view that as tops. I'm going to home my network, and now I'm ready to start adding in these particle trails. Now, the way that I add in particle trails is super simple. I have found, for me, the simplest and quickest way just in tops is to use texture 3D. So let's see what happens when I add in that texture 3D. So we can see I add that texture 3D in. It creates 32 slices as of now of that sequence, so 32 time slices. So essentially I have the history of my particle 32 times, so I can turn that down, or I can go even higher if my computer can handle it, so it's 118, back down to a cache size of 32, which is more than good enough for the time being. The other parameter we have access to is the step size, and basically the step size is how often we're taking a snapshot. So we can see here it sort of gets really jittery, and that's because it's only taking a snapshot every 13 frames. So in general, it's best to have a step size of 1 just to have something that looks a little bit more seamless. And we can do a pulse. So I'm going to go in and just turn this transform scale down to like 0.01 just to make that look a little bit nicer. I also think that if I do maybe 12 particles, that's going to maybe even things out a bit more and we can see those trails a bit better. The next thing I want to do is I'm just going to copy that noise, pop it into another texture 3D. In this case, I'm just going to have this as monochrome. I want to turn up that amplitude quite a bit. I'm going to turn up the period a little bit too. I'm going to drag this out to a null, and I'm going to label this size. This is also going to be dragged to my geo to instance, and it will instance the scale values. So let's just place R, R, R. So we can see that we have manipulated those scale values a little bit. If I go in with my camera and zoom in, we can see that things have a different scale as they move around. We can amplify that a little bit more to make it more like a kind of a bug-like worm effect by turning up that transform on the Z so things are moving a little bit faster, and also just playing around with some of these values. Once you've set up the particle trails and sizing to something that you like, then you're ready to work on the plexus. I'm going to home my network. I'm going to go to the camera and I'm just going to drag out so I can actually see all of the particles, or more or less all of them, something like this. And I'm going to start working to create those lines that connect all the particles. To do that, I'm going to work with my kind of source positions from this noise, I'm going to drag, and I'm going to go from top to chop. And this is going to be a bit of an exercise in turning data into multiple formats to utilize different families of operators in TouchDesigner to do specific things. So to get there, I'm going to go to my crop tab. I want to view the full image, so we can see we've got all of these rows. And rather than use a shuffle, I'm just going to go into the first tab of image and output as a single channel set. If you want to, you can remove the alpha channel because we won't be using that, but it's totally up to you. Once I have this information in chop form, I'm going to bring it into SOP land. So I'll go to chop 2. And by default, it's looking for channel scope of TX, TY, TZ. We're just going to delete that and put in our red, green, blue values that give us this visualization of sort of connected lines. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my viewer active. I'm going to go to display options, and I'm going to click on this little button here that has point numbers. This basically allows me to go in and look at what these different vertices and point numbers are. And this will come in handy in a minute when I apply a sort in SOP land. And the reason I'm doing a sort in SOPs versus in chops, which also has a sort, will become apparent in a minute. So here I can sort based on a specific channel, so I could select a channel index to sort by. But because we're now working in a 3D environment, what I can do is I can do things like sort by XYZ, kind of similar to the sort chop, but I can also sort to closest neighbor, which is what we want to do. Right now, it's not going to look like much, but it has quite a fundamental change. So let's just take a look at that on the display. I'm just going to pause my network. And we can see that if we look at this point here, it says 51. This point says 98, 99, 97. So basically things are grouped by closest neighbor, which makes a lot more sense when we're going to sort of connect lines. Let's home that, press A. And I can now bring this out into a geo. Take the geo. We can see we've got these lines, so there's a few more things we have to do, but let's start adding that into our mix. I'm going to create a line material. I'm going to drag that on. So we can see now we're connected by all of these lines. For whatever reason, I have found that simply just sorting it in SOP world resets the particles to those positions, but it doesn't make the change that I want. So I'm going to go back from SOPs into chops, go SOP 2, and so we can see that that data has been changed quite fundamentally. And then it seems a bit counterintuitive, but I'm going to bring that back into a SOP. And so we can see that now it looks very different if we compare the two outputs. We can see that this has applied that sorting and has created this interesting pattern. So I'll now connect that. And we can see that that new form of connecting based on the proximity to particle neighbors has been applied. And it's looking really cool. It looks much nicer and sort of more streamlined than this visual. If you want to, you can also bring this into a convert and try different sort of materials of visualizing it. Some of them are going to be pretty glitchy. Some of them aren't going to change at all. But you can sort of play around with that and have things that are more curved. I'm going to go ahead and delete that convert because I just want the traditional connected line visualization. And we're getting really close to being done. I'm not going to get really into post-production things because that's something that I'm excited to see you experiment with. But you know, the basic things we can do is we can play with this line. We can make it bigger and smaller based on if it's far or near. And we can also go in and just change the color. So I'm going to make it a little bit brighter for both the near and far. Could also add color if you wanted to, but I'm just going to stick with sort of good old-fashioned monochrome. And the final thing that we could do to sort of like zhuzh this up a little bit is we can add color to those particles. So we could just use one of our pre-built particle textures, or we could make something a little bit new for color. So let's take that noise, just copy that, add a new null for color. And let's just tweak the noise to make it more vibrant. Move it up to a value of like 1. You know, let's smooth out the period. Let's play with the exponent a little bit. Obviously this can be tweaked later. And then back in my geo, the first geo, which is instancing those particles, I'm going to go to the second instance tab. So we have multiple instancing tabs. Let's see if I can drag this out. Instance 2. And I'm going to take my color, which is hidden now, and I'm going to drag that to color up. And I'll start populating with the R, with the G, and with the B. So now my colors have been added. If I kind of played a little bit more with that noise and made it a bit more, let's say, granular, you can see that the colors changing throughout each particle trail. So you can play around with that as well to get something that feels a bit more organic. You could also put in a video or an image. Let's try that. Okay, so unfortunately my camera stopped recording again. In the section where I talked that wasn't recorded, I basically showed you how to add in different textures to color your network. So in this case, I'm using a video device in. The issue here is if I plug that in directly, we're going to have an error in our geo because basically the number of points for all of those different inputs for the position, the size, and the color, they no longer match. So an easy fix for that is just to set up a fit object that is linked to your resolution for the noise textures for your particle system. And we fit that to that resolution and set it to fit outside. We can see in this case it's pretty grainy, but we get an idea of those particles coming through that are responding in real time. The other thing I did was I created a trail parameter. And so this is basically to solve the same issue from happening, which is if I, for example, changed one of these without changing the others, from these texture 3Ds, if I change this, we're going to again get that error because the number of points in our texture don't match. So basically the 3 cache sizes have to be the same size. So how I populated that was I selected all of these, I made my viewer active, and I dragged that trail parameter. And now when I change that trail parameter, we can see that all linked. The other thing I wanted to show you was how to make this into an interactive panel. So rather than having a camera, you can have an interactive camera that you can control through a panel. So if I go to my tools menu in the palette and drag out the camera viewport, it's not going to automatically connect. We can see that it's recognized and it's kind of being linked to, but it's not automatically linking up to that render. We could either change the name of it to cam1, or we can just drag in that reference. The cam viewport has a few cool things. I can obviously make it active and manipulate it like I would a regular camera, but I can also go in and turn on this auto rotate tag, which allows me to essentially drag in a direction and release, and it's going to continue rotating at the sort of the velocity that I drag and release at. So I could kind of go really fast or create something super slow. And this is really useful for when you're sort of trying out different 3D networks and wanting to view it in lots of angles in kind of quick succession. You can quite easily visualize that. The method I want to show you is basically how we can visualize it in a panel, because a panel allows us to basically access this component as a element that we can interact with. So what we've got to do is under this panel comp component, we're going to change that from render view to dot dot. And this is just going to signify that we're going to go up one level. And we just have to reference the top that we want to image when we're kind of controlling this section in our up layer, so in our project layer. So I'm going to press the up key to go up, and I'm in my project container, which has the panel information. We'll play with the layout stuff later, but for now I want to go to the look tab, and I'm going to do /output, and now my output is in this side panel that I can actually control. So it's kind of like having a top viewer on the side that also has interactivity, which is really great. You might be able to see this is kind of squished right now, so I can go in to layout and I can change the width and the height to match what I'm rendering, so 1280 by 720. So now that looks much better. And finally, if I go into this panel tab, I have a few more options. If I enable my middle button, I can hold my Alt key and zoom in and out. And if I enable this right button, I can hold down my right mouse and drag to maneuver this around. I can always press the H key for home to move back to a central position where everything's homed to 0, 0, 0. So this is a sort of useful additional thing for visualizing 3D networks and playing with them and having some kind of interactivity, which for me makes it a bit easier to build on them because I don't have to keep adjusting camera angles. I can just go in and move to the position I want to see. You can do a few things to sort of really radically change this network. So one of the things that I think is a nice thing to change is if you play around with this period and make it super high, you get something that's much more consistent and organic, that's kind of linked together by these interconnected lines. So that can kind of be a fun effect to play around with, or you can go the complete opposite direction and have something that is like we've been working on so far, that's a bit more random, where everything has its own sort of agency and moves in that way. Or you can find something in between, maybe around here. And obviously you can play with things like the exponent to control those movements too, or even have things that are animated. So if I went in and did like a kind of a sinusoidal function, let's do that. And let's do +1. Let's see what happens. Maybe speed that up a little bit. You get this kind of interesting network that moves between being a sort of a circle and a box. So you can sort of create different vibes by playing around with that kind of connectivity, and obviously thinking about things like elongating. Right now we can see my frame rate still at 60, so that means I have a lot of room to sort of create more particles and create longer trails. I think when I get above like 100 or 200 particles per point in the trail, it gets a bit slow. Also, obviously, if I'm ramping this up to something like 40, it exponentially will slow down. You can see that's happening, but very slowly. So it's good to keep it in sort of like the 10 to 20 region, and then it's relatively fast. But I hope you have fun with this network, and stay tuned for more tutorials, and I'll see you soon.